Pawn e2 to e4. Pawn e7 to e6. Pawn d2 to d4. Pawn d7 to d5. Knight b1 to c3. Knight g8 to f6. Bishop c1 to g5. Bishop f8 to e7. Pawn e4 to e5. Knight f6 to d7. Bishop g5 takes e7. Queen d8 takes e7. Queen d1 to d2. Castle kingside. Pawn f2 to f4. Pawn c7 to c5. Knight g1 to f3. Knight b8 to c6. Bishop f1 to e2. Pawn f7 to f6. Pawn e5 takes f6. Queen e7 takes f6. Pawn g2 to g3. Pawn c5 takes d4. Knight c3 to b5. Pawn e6 to e5. Knight b5 to c7. Rook a8 to b8. Knight c7 takes d5. Queen f6 to d6. Pawn c2 to c4. Pawn d4 takes c3. Queen d2 takes c3. King g8 to h8. Rook a1 to d1. Pawn e5 takes f4. Knight d5 takes f4. Queen d6 to c5. Queen c3 takes c5. Knight d7 takes c5. Castle kingside. Bishop c8 to g4. Pawn h2 to h3. Bishop g4 to f5. Knight f3 to g5. Knight c5 to e4. Knight g5 takes e4. Bishop f5 takes e4. Rook d1 to d6. Knight c6 to e5. Bishop e2 to h5. Bishop e4 to f5. Rook f1 to e1. Knight e5 to c4. Rook d6 to d4. Rook b8 to c8. Pawn g3 to g4. Pawn g7 to g6. Pawn g4 takes f5. Pawn g6 takes h5. Pawn f5 to f6. Knight c4 takes b2. Knight f4 takes h5. Rook c8 to c5. Knight h5 to f4. Rook c5 to f5. Rook e1 to e7. Rook f8 takes f6. Knight f4 to e6. Rook f6 to g6, check. Rook d4 to g4. Rook g6 takes e6. Rook e7 takes e6. Rook f5 to f8. Rook e6 to e7. Knight b2 to d3. Rook e7 takes b7. Pawn a7 to a6. Rook g4 to h4. Rook f8 to g8, check. King g1 to f1. Rook g8 to g7. Rook b7 to b8, check. Rook g7 to g8. Rook b8 to b7. Rook g8 to g7. Rook b7 to b8, check. Rook g7 to g8. Rook b8 takes g8, check. King h8 takes g8. King f1 to e2. Knight d3 to c5. Rook h4 to h6. Pawn a6 to a5. Rook h6 to h5. Knight c5 to d7. Rook h5 takes a5. King g8 to f7. Pawn a2 to a4. King f7 to e7. Rook a5 to h5. Knight d7 to f6. Rook h5 to h6. Knight f6 to d5. Pawn a4 to a5. King e7 to d7. Rook h6 takes h7, check. King d7 to c8. Pawn a5 to a6. King c8 to b8. Rook h7 to b7, check. King b8 to a8. Pawn h3 to h4. Knight d5 to f6. King e2 to f3. Knight f6 to g4. Rook b7 to g7. Knight g4 to f6. Rook g7 to f7. Knight f6 to e8. Rook f7 to f8. King a8 to a7. Rook f8 takes e8. King a7 takes a6. Pawn h4 to h5. King a6 to b5. Pawn h5 to h6. King b5 to c6. Pawn h6 to h7. King c6 to c7. Rook e8 to e6. King c7 to d7. Rook e6 to g6. King d7 to e7. Pawn h7 to h8, promoting to queen. King e7 to d7. Queen h8 to h7, check. King d7 to c8. Rook g6 to g8, checkmate.